I was always the one who kept things running. Not because anyone asked me to, not because I enjoyed it, necessarily, but because someone had to, and in my family, that someone was always me. I was the one who remembered birthdays. I was the one who organized dinners, and made sure my mother's car went in for its oil change. I was the one who called my brother on his worst days even when he never thought to call me on mine. That was just how things worked. I told myself it was fine. I told myself for a long time my name is Samantha, Sam, most people call me, and I'm 32 years old. I grew up in Barrie, Ontario, a mid-sized city about 90 minutes north of Toronto. We weren't wealthy, but we weren't struggling either. My parents both worked. My dad, for most of my childhood, drove long-haul routes across Ontario and Quebec. My mom worked at the hospital, not as a nurse, as a billing coordinator. She was sharp, organized it. I think I got that from her. The other things I got from her I'm still trying to sort out. My brother is 2 years older than me. His name is Evan. Growing up, Evan and I were close enough. We shared a bathroom, fought over the remote, ate cereal together on Saturday mornings watching cartoons. Nothing unusual. But somewhere in our teenage years, something shifted. My parents started looking at Evan differently. He was the first one to go to university. He got into Western for business, and my parents drove him there themselves, helped him move in, took him out for dinner at a nice steakhouse the night before his first day. I went to Lakehead for social work 2 years later. I took the bus. I want to be clear. I'm not saying my parents didn't love me. I believe they did. I think they still do, in their way. But love and attention aren't the same thing. Love and showing up aren't the same thing either. I learned that lesson in a way I never expected. On a Tuesday morning in November, lying in a hospital bed at Royal Victoria Regional Health Centre, watching a nurse adjust my IV while my phone sat silent on the bedside table. My surgery had been scheduled for months. I had a fibroid that had grown to a point where my doctor said it couldn't wait much longer. It wasn't cancer, but it was causing real problems. Fatigue, pain, disruption to my cycle that made some weeks almost unbearable. My gynecologist referred me to a specialist, and by the time I got through the wait list and all the preoperative appointments, the date was set, November 14th. The problem was that my parents had booked a trip to Costa Rica. They had planned it in the spring, long before my surgery was even on the horizon. It was their 35th wedding anniversary, and my brother had helped organize the whole thing. A 2-week resort trip, all-inclusive, somewhere near Manuel Antonio. They'd never traveled outside of North America before. My mom had been talking about it since June. She bought a new swimsuit. She got a passport photo taken 3 times because she kept thinking she looked tired in the first 2. When I found out my surgery date, I checked the calendar and felt my stomach drop. They were leaving on November 10th. They'd be gone until the 24th. I called my mom first. I told her what the date was. I explained what the procedure involved. A laparoscopic myomectomy, 2 to 3 days in hospital, 6 weeks of recovery. I told her I was nervous. I hadn't been in hospital since I had my tonsils out at 8 years old, and even then, I'd cried the whole night before. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Oh, sweetheart, can't you move it?" I explained that the specialist had one opening in her schedule before the new year, that the wait list was already long, that my doctor had said sooner was better. My mom said she understood. She said she'd talk to my dad. She said she was sure it would all work out. She called me back 2 days later to tell me they were going to keep the trip. She said it wasn't an emergency. She said she'd already put the deposit down on the excursions. She said Evan was going too, and he'd already requested the time off work. She said I was going to be in the hospital anyway, so it wasn't like I'd be alone. She said I was strong and independent, and that I'd be fine. I don't remember what I said back to her. Something agreeable probably. Something that let her off the hook, because that was what I did. What I remember is hanging up the phone and sitting in my apartment kitchen in the dark for a long time. The person who called me that evening was my grandfather, my dad's father, a 78-year-old retired electrician from Sudbury named Walter. Everyone calls him Walt. He has hands like 2 catcher's mitts, and a voice that sounds like gravel being poured into a tin can. And he is, without question, the best person I have ever known. Grandpa Walt had heard from my dad that the surgery was coming up. He called to ask how I was doing. Not whether I had it handled. Not whether I needed anything specific. He just asked how I was doing. And I don't know what it was about that. The simplicity of it maybe, or just the fact that it was him, but I started crying before I even finished answering. He listened. He didn't try to fix anything or offer explanations for why my parents had made the decision they made. He just listened until I was done. And then he said, "I'll be there." I told him he didn't have to. He lives nearly 4 hours away. He's 78. He has a bad knee. He said, Samantha, I'll be there. He drove down on November 12th and stayed in my spare bedroom. He brought a casserole his neighbor Doris had made because he said he couldn't cook well enough to feed someone recovering from surgery, and he wanted to be honest about that. He made me laugh for the first time in 2 weeks. The morning of November 14th, he drove me to the hospital at 5:30 in the morning. He sat in the waiting area for 4 hours. When they brought me to recovery, and I was still groggy and confused and couldn't stop shaking from the anesthesia, he was the face I saw when I opened my eyes. He had a Tim Hortons cup in each hand and a look on his face that I can only describe as steady. Like he'd been there 100 times and would be there 100 more if that's what it took. I stayed in hospital until the 16th. He was there every day. He talked to my nurses. He wrote down the medication instructions when I was too foggy to retain them. He went to the hospital pharmacy and had everything filled before we even left the building. He drove me home slowly, hit every bump as gently as he could, and when I said I needed to lie down, he tucked a blanket around me and turned the heat up 2 degrees without being asked. My parents sent a text from Costa Rica the morning after my surgery. It said, "Heard from Walt that everything went well. So relieved. Enjoy your rest. Love Mom and Dad." My brother sent a voice message that night. He was on the beach somewhere. I could hear the waves, and he said he was glad it went okay and that he'd catch up with me when they were back. The weeks that followed were harder than I expected. Recovery from a myomectomy isn't gentle. I couldn't drive. I couldn't lift anything heavier than a bag of groceries. I was exhausted in a way that felt cellular, like even my bones were tired. I had physiotherapy appointments twice a week on the other side of town, and Grandpa Walt drove me to every single one. He sat in the waiting room with his crossword puzzle and a thermos of instant coffee he'd made at home because he said hospital coffee was highway robbery at $4 a cup. We talked a lot during those drives, long stretches of highway, the November trees bare and gray, Lake Simcoe flat and cold out the passenger window. He told me about his own father, who had died young. He told me about the early years of his marriage, the hard ones he didn't talk about often. He told me that in his experience, the people who showed up were almost never the people you expected. I told him about the text from my mom. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then he said, "I know." I don't think he was keeping notes intentionally at first. He mentioned once, around the 3rd week, that he'd been saving some of the messages, the texts and the voice memos from Costa Rica, because he wanted to show them to my dad when he was ready to have a real conversation. He said it quietly, almost to himself, like he was just thinking out loud. I didn't think much of it at the time. My parents came home on November 24th. They were tan, relaxed, full of stories about the howler monkeys and the boat tour and the sunset they'd seen from their balcony on their anniversary night. My mom brought me back a small woven bag she'd bought at a market. She set it on my kitchen counter, hugged me carefully because of my incision, and then spent 20 minutes telling me about the excursion to the waterfall. She didn't ask about my recovery until I brought it up. When I did, she nodded and said she was glad it had gone well, and then she said something that I've thought about almost every day since. She said, "You know, it was actually good timing, in a way. You would have just been worried about us being gone anyway. At least this way you had something to focus on." I didn't say anything. I looked at the woven bag on the counter. I looked at the scar I could feel under my sweater. My brother came by that weekend with his girlfriend and a bottle of wine. He asked how I was feeling and I was getting there. He said I looked good. Then he and my dad talked about hockey for 45 minutes, while my mom and his girlfriend looked at photos from the trip on her phone. Nobody asked about the physiotherapy. Nobody asked about the medication, or the follow-up appointment, or whether I'd been managing the grocery situation, or whether I'd been sleeping, or whether I'd been scared. Grandpa Walt saw all of this. He was still staying in my spare room. I'd asked him to extend his visit because honestly I wasn't ready for him to leave, and he'd said yes without making me feel guilty for asking. He sat at my kitchen table through that Sunday visit. I could see him watching. Not in a dramatic way. Just watching. It was around that time that I realized he had been taking notes. Not literally. He wasn't carrying a notebook around, but on his phone, which he'd only gotten 2 years ago and operated with 2 fingers on a good day, he had been screenshotting things. The texts, the voice messages, a group chat where my brother had sent photos from Costa Rica the day after my surgery, with everyone reacting with heart emojis and nobody mentioning me once. A message from my mom asking my dad to e-transfer her for the excursion deposit the same morning I was in the recovery ward. He showed me one evening after everyone had gone home. He handed me his phone and scrolled slowly, letting me read each one. I sat very still. He said, "I'm not doing anything with these unless you want me to. I just thought someone should have them." I thought about that for a long time. I didn't say yes right away. I needed to sit with it. In December, my parents announced they were hosting a big dinner for New Year's Eve. They decided to have the whole extended family over. Aunts, uncles, cousins, family, friends. To celebrate the anniversary trip and ring in the new year. My mom was excited. She sent a group message with a menu and asked everyone to bring something. She signed off with 3 party popper emojis. I almost didn't go. I thought about it seriously. I'd been doing a lot of thinking in those weeks about what I wanted my life to look like, who I wanted in it, what I was willing to keep tolerating. My therapist. I'd started seeing someone in October, a woman named Dr. Reyes. Had been asking me to think about what I would say if I could say anything without consequence. I'd been thinking about that question. I went to the dinner. I brought a tray of butter tarts from a bakery in Barrie that my grandmother, Walt's late wife, had loved. I sat at the table and I smiled and I passed the salad. My brother made a toast to my parents and everyone clinked their glasses and my dad teared up a little. And then Grandpa Walt asked if he could say a few words. My dad smiled and said of course. My mom looked pleased. Grandpa stood up slowly. He's not as steady as he used to be. And he cleared his throat. He thanked everyone for coming. He said he was proud of his son for building a life worth celebrating. He talked about my grandmother, about how much she would have loved to be there. About how she always said that family was the most important thing you could ever hold on to. Then he paused. He reached into the breast pocket of his blazer and took out his phone. He said he wanted to share a few things that had happened over the past 2 months. He said he'd been present for a lot of it, and he felt it was important that the people in this room know what he'd seen. He read the text my mom had sent the morning after my surgery, the one about being relieved and telling me to enjoy my rest. He read it slowly and clearly. He noted that it had been sent at 11:47 a.m., and that I had been in the recovery ward since 9:15 a.m. He read the voice message from my brother. He didn't play it. He read it out from the transcript, including the part where you could hear the waves in the background. He showed the group chat, scrolling through it slowly so people could see the dates. He said the photos from the beach had been sent at 2:30 p.m. on November 14th. He said that was 3 hours after I had come out of surgery. He said that in that 3-hour window, nobody in the chat had mentioned my name. The room was very quiet. My aunt, my dad's sister, asked what this was about. My dad started to say something. My mom's face had gone very still. I drove Samantha to the hospital at 5:30 in the morning. I sat in that waiting room alone for 4 hours. I was the one who held her hand when she woke up. I was the one who went to the pharmacy, drove her to every physiotherapy appointment, and made sure she wasn't alone in her apartment at night when she was in pain. I'm not telling you this to embarrass anyone. I'm telling you this because I want this family to understand what actually happened, because right now you're all sitting here celebrating the anniversary trip, and nobody in this room has asked Samantha how she's doing. He sat down. For a moment nothing happened, then my cousin Petra, she's about my age, we've always been close, turned to me and said quietly, "Are you okay, Sam? Are you actually okay?" And that was the thing that broke me open. Not the big moment, not Grandpa Walt standing up. It was my cousin asking me simply whether I was okay. I said I was getting there. My dad was upset. Not at me, I don't think, but at himself. And it was coming out sideways, in this stiff, tight-jawed way where he kept saying that Walt had no right to air private family business in front of everyone. My mom cried. My brother sat with his arms crossed and didn't look at me for a long time. But my aunt and uncle came and sat next to me. My cousin stayed beside me for the rest of the night. One of my parents' friends, a woman named Grace who had known my mom since high school, came to find me in the kitchen while I was refilling my water and put her hand on my arm and said, "I had no idea, sweetheart. I'm so sorry." Nobody came to me that night with a clean apology. Not my mom, not my dad, not Evan. The dinner ended awkwardly, people drifting out earlier than they might have otherwise. My mom hugged me at the door and said she loved me and that we'd talk, and I could see that she meant it. But I also knew that talking in our family usually meant smoothing things over until the discomfort passed. But something had changed anyway, something real. In January, my dad called me. Not a text, not a group message, a call on a Wednesday afternoon. He said he'd been thinking a lot about November. He said he wasn't sure they'd made the right call about the trip. He said it quietly, haltingly, in the way that people who aren't used to admitting things speak. I didn't rush him. I let him get through it. My mom took longer. She and I had coffee in February at a place near her work. We sat across from each other with our mugs, and she talked around it for a while before she finally said she was sorry she hadn't been there. She said she'd been telling herself that I was capable and independent, and that was true, she said. But she realized those weren't good enough reasons. She said she'd been thinking about how her mother had never once shown up for her, and she'd promised herself she'd be different, and she was starting to understand that promise had some gaps in it. I don't know if any of this is fixed. I don't think you fix 32 years of patterns over coffee, but something shifted, and I could feel it. Something that had been held at a careful distance was finally being touched. My brother and I talked too, eventually. In March, over the phone, late on a Friday night, he said he hadn't thought about it the way I'd experienced it. He said he'd assumed I was okay because I seemed okay, and I said that was kind of the whole problem, wasn't it? That I'd been performing okay my entire life, and he'd been comfortable letting me. He didn't have a great answer for that, but he stayed on the phone. Grandpa Walt drove back to Sudbury in early January. Before he left, we sat in my kitchen for the last morning coffee of his visit. It was still dark outside, and the house was quiet, and I made us eggs because that was something I could finally do again without hesitation. I asked him why he'd said something that night, not whether it was the right thing. I knew it was the right thing, but why then? Why there? He thought about it for a minute. He wrapped both hands around his mug. He said, "Because I've watched this family for a long time. And I've seen how you get looked past, Sam. I've seen it since you were small, and I thought, if not now then when? If not in front of everyone who claims to love you, then where?" He said, "You didn't do anything wrong by needing people." I wanted someone to say that out loud. I cried, which didn't surprise either of us. He patted my hand in that way he does, like he's confirming something. Then he finished his eggs and went to pack his bag. I drove him out to his truck in the driveway. It was cold, the kind of cold that feels personal in January in Ontario. He put his bag in the back and then turned around and held both my hands in his for a moment. He said, "You're going to be fine, you know." And standing there in the driveway in the cold, I believed him. Not because everything had been resolved, and not because my family had become something different overnight, but because I understood something now that I hadn't before. I had spent my whole life measuring love by who said they loved me. But love isn't something you declare in a group chat from a beach in Costa Rica. Love is a 45-minute drive in the dark to a hospital waiting room. Love is 2 fingers on a phone screen, saving screenshots because someone should. Love is standing up at a dinner table and saying the thing that everyone else decided it was easier not to say. I still think about the morning after my surgery, the recovery ward, the IV in my hand, the way I kept looking at the door. I was waiting for someone to come, and no one did. And then there was Grandpa Walt, in his blazer, with his 2 Tim Hortons cups, steady as anything. 32 years old, and that's when I finally understood what showing up actually meant. I hope my family is learning it too. I think, slowly they are. And I know now that whatever happens, I'm not alone. I haven't been alone since the moment he walked through that door.